think about. God called this creation good back in Genesis. We just about to call it gone. By the way, we humans are messing with this place that God has given us as a trust. So we have to be alert how to be good stewards of God's creation or what's left of it. Because as it goes, we go. This is our earth and our home. Same with our neighbors. They need care too. A Harvard sociologist, I couldn't believe when I read this, a Harvard sociologist recently said there are a lot fewer people being killed today in wars around the world than ever before. Now, does it look that way to you? It doesn't seem that way. And I think part of the issue is there's more and more conflicts in more and more places, tearing apart more and more lives. They may not actually be dying, but more refugees right now in the world than any time since World War II. Over 50 million people without a place to call home because of some conflict in their place or environmental collapse or ethnic cleansing or you name it, they got it. So there's a lot more trouble in the world in a lot more places. Maybe not as many absolute deaths, but a lot of trouble and trauma for people just trying to find a place of security and safety and clean water and food for their families. And thank goodness for the crop walk and you guys taking part in that. They are reaching, Church World Services, reaching out to those people in all of those situations all around the world.
David Radcliff, director of the New Community Project, continues to demonstrate that one person can make a difference. The goal of the New Community Project is pretty big, to change the world by the way we relate to this planet. It's likely to change one person at a time. Unfortunately, it's going to take some speedy action if we're going to save the earth from exploitation by all of us humans. Hello, I'm Brent Carlson. Welcome to Brethren Voices. For David Radcliff and the New Community Project, it means educating people about what is happening to this earth and attempting to find some solutions. Because, as David says, we are in trouble. Brethren Voices caught up with him on one of his speaking engagements. It was just a day after he learned a few things from his granddaughter, Julia, concerning palm oil.
And she's on to stuff like palm oil, which I don't know if you've heard about, but it's this ingredient in about everything from our cosmetics to our ice cream. They get it from the palm tree, and they're cutting down tropical forests all around the world to harvest this palm oil, and Julia's on to stuff like that. Last spring, I was out visiting them, and her mother, bless her heart, buys the 100% nothing but peanuts peanut butter. You know what I'm talking about? I mean, it's healthy, but, you know, it don't really taste like peanut butter. Anyhow, I'm feeling like these kids are suffering. And so I'm the grandparent. I got some rights in this situation. So I'm coming down. I'm heading down from Harrisburg to their house, and I was going to stop in by the Giant and get some stuff for supper. Well, I cruised the peanut butter aisle, as I usually do in any store, just because I'm always looking for sales on peanut butter. And there it was, the Planters. The Planters peanut butter, marked down special, half price. So I got 2 of them. I'm thinking I can wait till I get this to the grandkids. They're going to be so elated. So I take that stuff home. I proudly walk in as the grandparent bearing gifts. You should have seen their faces light up. First thing out of Julia's mouth is, "Pop, Pop, does it have palm oil?" In my excitement, I hadn't thought to look. In her excitement, she hadn't forgot to ask.
Planters. Planters has palm oil, and so does Jif peanut butter. It's actually not considered, Jif isn't considered peanut butter, it's considered peanut spread, because it has it's natural, but it has so much of one thing that it can't be considered butter anymore. People get palm oil from trees in the rainforest, and the rainforest, the Amazon rainforest itself, produces 20% of our oxygen, and so it's really, really important that the rainforest can't be cut down, because it sucks in the carbon dioxide, which cuts down on the global warming. And also the rainforest is home to orangutans and so many other creatures. The Asian elephant, lemurs, even bugs. There are certain, it's said that none of the trees in the rainforest touch, and some species of bugs only live in one tree. So if that tree is cut down, all that species of bugs is, it doesn't live anymore.
And then there are college campuses. College is supposed to be the beginning of an exciting new chapter in a young person's life, but it often turns out to be more like a page from a horror novel for the young women who enroll. 1 out of 5 will be assaulted on college campuses in the United States during their 4-year matriculation. There's something wrong with the society that puts its women in that kind of predicament at the hands of the men. And then we look abroad: Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Nigeria, Libya, the Gaza Strip, Honduras. In the latter case, drug-induced wars. I don't mean the people are on drugs, but the drugs are transiting through Honduras to us, and it's causing a lot of conflict and death in a poor Central American country that deserves much better than that, because I've been there many times. Some of you may know people there, may have been there yourselves. Hi, and then, look around the other places in the world. Some combination of religion and conflict over religion, ethnic hatred, a reaction to imperialism, this ISIS thing we got going on now in Iraq and Syria. ISIS came into being after the U.S. invasion of Iraq. A response to the way the Sunnis were being put down in that whole process, and to what the United States was doing there in terms of an imperial power, and then ISIS springs up. Boko Haram, the group that's kidnapped those brethren girls in Nigeria, also came out of the corruption of their own nation, their own country, and their oil interests and all that other kind of stuff going on, plus climate change. And the Church of the Brethren this year turned down a statement on climate change. Climate change is causing conflicts like the one in Nigeria, actually like the one in Syria. In Nigeria, climate change is affecting the countries around Nigeria. Chad and Niger, the people are leaving there because they can't find work in the farms anymore, and they're ready recruits for Boko Haram, who brings them into their quasi-religious, quasi-terrorist movement, which ends up abducting hundreds of girls. Oh boy, well, this ISIS thing in Syria, President Obama's rationale for the air war there against ISIS, it sort of made a lot of sense when you heard him talk about it on television. They're bad people doing bad things to mostly innocent people. And importantly for our own national interests, it's threatening the stability of that house of cards that is Iraq after our invasion. And by the way, we invested $1 trillion and 2 million soldiers' lives in Iraq. We don't want to see it fail, believe me. So, when you're hearing Obama talk, it sort of made sense that ISIS has to be stopped by any means necessary. It just makes sense, doesn't it? Well, the disciples were making that same case. There in that passage of Scripture that Julia read for us this morning. They were making the same case to Jesus there in Luke chapter 9. He and they were on a rendezvous with destiny. Jerusalem was looming up ahead on the horizon. They and he had sacrificed a lot for that mission. They'd left behind family and fishing boats. They weren't asking for much along the way, a little respect, a little cooperation, maybe a small bit of recognition of how special they were. You can see that in the verses before the story about the calling down fire from heaven. They were arguing among them about who was the greatest. And somebody doing some good work, they wanted to shut that operation down because they weren't one of them, whoever it was. So this disciples had a bit of an attitude here, it seemed like. And then they had Jesus also, by the way, God's Son and everything. So they deserved a little special treatment as they moved from town to town on their way to destiny. And here this little uppity Samaritan village. They worship differently, associated with Israel's enemies, even intermarried with infidels. And then these Samaritans had the nerve to say, "Hit the road, Jack," or Jesus, as the case may be, as they came looking for a place just to bed down for the night on their way on to Jerusalem. When the disciples approached them about putting them up as they made their way toward more important places. Can you imagine? What's wrong with these people? You can hear them saying. Quickly turns to, what did we expect from those people? They're just Samaritans. And the temptation presented itself to respond to insult with injury. Jesus, would you like for us to call down fire from heaven? That sounds to me like a nuclear attack. That feels like history's first nuclear attack in the making right there in the minds of those disciples. They insulted us. They disrespected our mission. They dissed our leader. We'll show them a thing or two. Why not? They're just Samaritans. It was as if it was ever clear that Jesus was both God and man, human and divine, it might have been here. What human leader would have been able to resist such a suggestion? They dissed us, let's get them. What human leader would have been able to resist such an opportunity? And they say on the crime shows on TV, I don't know if any of you guys watch any of those crime shows on TV, but what the police are always looking for is motive, means, and opportunity. Jesus had them all right here in this moment. He had been insulted, he had great power, and he had the moment. It was his to command. But instead of command, the disciples got a reprimand. A very strong word, evidently, in the Greek. And I'm no Greek scholar, but that word rebuke is like say, get your mind together, boys. What are you thinking? It's like when your mama used your middle name too, Julia Margaret. You know somebody meaning business when they use a word like that towards you. In a word, he strongly chastised them for entertaining such a thought. And then they went on their way. Only God-man could rise to this kind of an occasion, resisting the path we so typically follow in a world around ourselves. Now, truth about it is, had Jesus given in to this urge to use violence in the face of this insult and affront, he would have also given tacit approval to every holy war ever fought. Anybody going to war for their cause, for their religion, for their group's special interest, they would have been able to say, oh, look what Jesus did. If Jesus did it, it must be all right. And our world would have been in even worse shape than it is now, with nothing to restrain it. But it wasn't just Jesus' divinity that made him pull back from nuking that little community. He was also just plain smarter than us. He knew that those chickens, or we might say those hawks of war, always come home to roost. And we are finding that in the Middle East. The hawks of war come home to roost. A few chapters later, he said it himself, those who live by the sword die by the sword. Our short-term fixes have the allure of immediate gratification. But listen to any seasoned commentator who has lived in or is living now in the Middle East, and they will tell you until you deal with the core issues that are facing people over there, this situation is not going to change. Until you're dealing with the deep-seated issues of that region, outside intervention, corrupt leaders often propped up by Western powers, ethnic and religious intolerance, weapons funded by oil money. Until you deal with all these things, you are not going to solve the issues of this region. Not by air, not by ground, not by sea. We said this on the eve of our war with Iraq. Some of us in the Church of the Brethren, we said war is not the answer. Tell you what, friends, we were right. It was not the answer in that situation. Now, you know what's happened to Christians in Iraq since the war. Speaking of unintended consequences. I took a delegation, a Church of the Brethren delegation, with two representatives from Atlantic Northeast District, actually, to Iraq in 2001, after September 11 and before the war. Because we wanted to visit the people there and see what they were living like under the sanctions that had been in place for a decade. Well, we were hosted there by the Middle East Council of Churches. And our immediate host was a man named Edward Ishu, a committed Christian, a fervent Iraqi nationalist, and a man with many, many connections. He got us into Muslim communities and in Christian communities with United Nations officials. He had us meet with a Shiite cleric. Now, the Shiites, they're the ones who came to power after Saddam was kicked out. So Saddam was a Sunni. The Shiites were the majority, but Saddam was lording it over them. Then the Shiites took power and began to root out the Sunnis. I mean, that's just how these things work. Anyway, we met with a Shiite cleric who was no friend of Saddam's. Again, the Sunnis were repressing the Shiites. But the Shiite cleric, well, first of all, he entered our group of 6 people. There were 6 of us. Into a hall about a little bit bigger than the sanctuary here. The guy sat us down. First thing he said to us, we Muslims, we welcome everyone, even our enemies, he said to us. We welcome everyone, even our enemies. Then he gave us about a 15 or 20-minute talking to, the summation of which was, why does America have to act like it's God in this world? Now here's a guy who theoretically would be happy for an invasion. He don't like the Sunni guy at the top, and this guy's a Shiite, but he also had grave reservations about what we may have had in mind at that point. Well, we left the day after Christmas to come back to the U.S. I worked through Edward Ishu, our host and guide, for some months after that, sending supplies for women and children through UNICEF that he coordinated through the Global Food Crisis Fund. I was working for the Church of the Brethren in those days. And then the war came and I lost touch with Edward. You know, war does that. Well, last fall I found him. Guess where? On Facebook. He was in Damascus, Syria, along with 650,000 other Iraqi Christians who had to flee their country from the Muslim on Christian violence that broke out after the fall of Saddam Hussein. Unintended consequences, or consequences that were going to come, but we just didn't have the good sense to recognize. I don't know. You can pick. Well, Jesus knew that there are these kinds of consequences to those kinds of actions. So not only was a nuclear strike wrong, the divine Jesus, it was also stupid. That's the human Jesus. The smarts Jesus. The 2 and 2 together makes 4 Jesus. He knew how these things, he knew it would undermine his mission as God's agent of reconciliation in this world, and it would deeply alienate a group that he regularly sought to reach out to. Who was the star of his most famous story? A good Samaritan. 2 words that never went together in the Jewish language. Good and Samaritan. Jesus regularly reached out to the Samaritans, and eventually the Samaritans were some of the first believers. Remember the woman at the well? She ran back to tell her village, and many believed because of her testimony. They were Samaritans. Jesus nuked that little village? They could be running to Jesus? I don't think so. He understood how this worked. And the disciples, they would have lost a valuable reminder of the humanity of every person, even the enemy, or worse, those who insult you. I mean, one thing we hurt more than an enemy is a person who runs us down. So where does this leave us as we try to keep up with a world like this? Whoa, what a mess we've got. Where does it leave us when we try to keep up with a world like this? From our gospel story, we learn at least two things. Violence is wrong, even when it may seem justified. Typically, the hawks of war come home to roost. And violence doesn't work. It may be self-gratifying in the short run, but in the long run, it's not going to pay off for anybody concerned. And from the streets of Ferguson to the Arab Street, we haven't learned yet to follow the things that make for peace, those deeper things, the respect, the opportunity, the equality before the law. This is the long-term work that needs to be done. I'm not sure our leaders are up to it. They're more into short-term goals. That leaves us. As individuals, we have to refuse to join in when people want to destroy others through slander or character assassination, or punish them for what they did or didn't do to us, even though the temptation often looms large to just do just that. When I was growing up in high school and early years of college, my family had a grocery store down in Blue Ridge, Virginia, my hometown. My dad started it partly because there was no grocery store within 10 miles of Roanoke, so it was a place for people out in our area to shop, and the other thing was to give his boys a job. And so my brother and I worked there every summer, and the local kids from the community worked there, bag boys and produce people and all that stuff. Well, our motto in that grocery store, and some of you have worked in stores like this, was the customer is always right. So we did our best to please the customers. Well, one day a customer came back who was irate. Something had happened. I don't know what to his order. Now, whether I, as the bag boy, put the eggs under the cans of peaches, which you know is bad policy in a grocery bag, or I'm not sure exactly what happened. But my dad was at the front of the store doing something, and the other cashiers were around, customers were around. This guy just cussed my dad out. Now, this is Baptist land. You don't use cuss words that freely down in Baptist land. But here, in front of the customers and his other employees, this guy was reading Dad the riot act about something that had happened to his order, and then stormed out of the store. Well, my dad, he was also of the opinion that the customer is right, and so he tried to accommodate the guy, saying, what kind of refund can I give you? I'm not sure how it was resolved, but the man didn't leave a happy person, even after being accommodated. Well, they say a couple of weeks later, this man who didn't live that far away from our store, his house caught fire and pretty much burned down. And they say that after, my pastor told me this later actually, they said that after the fire trucks left and the smoking ruins were all that remained, the first one on the scene was my dad bearing bags of groceries. The man just wept and later came to the Lord. We never know what may come of it if we don't do what we might do. And if we do, what others least expect. And we must continue to speak out as a church, the church of the brethren. Sometimes people listen to us. We're small, but some say mighty. Back in the 1990s, the United States was set to invade Haiti, a poor island nation in the Caribbean. I don't know what the issue was, but we were going to send in the Marines under President Clinton. Well, the National Council of Churches, that group of churches all around the United States, called together the leaders of all the churches on phone calls to set together a statement to send to the president about this situation. And the final phone call they were having, Donald Miller, our general secretary at the time, Church of the Brethren, was on the call. They went around, they came up with a statement. The statement said, we want to do everything possible to peacefully resolve this conflict. We have to find ways to negotiate an end to this trouble down there in Haiti. But as a last resort, if all else fails, then, perhaps a military intervention could be called for. Well, every other church leader went around and gave their affirmation to that. Don Miller, my boss at the time, our leader at the time, hadn't said anything. And Joan Brown Campbell, the head of the National Council of Churches, said, Don, what do you think about this? Because they want to know what the Church of the Brethren thinks about things like this. Because we can be a little contrarian. Don, what do you think about this? And Don said, I can't go along with a statement from the churches that says war is an okay alternative to trying to solve this problem. And I know our denomination wouldn't stand for it, he said, the Church of the Brethren. Well, what would you support, she said to Don. What would you say? He said, well, I would support our nation's effort to resolve this crisis using any means short of violence. Well, she went around the phone call circle again. Every other leader of denomination, head of communion, the Episcopals, the Methodists, the Lutherans, all those, they all gave their affirmation to what Don had suggested. That was put forward as the language of the letter to the President of the United States. It was sent off. A few days later, the crisis was coming to a head. Actually, the planes were in the air, having left from Miami, the Air Force planes with the troops. A settlement was negotiated with the planes in mid-flight. They turned around and came home. President Clinton wrote the church leaders after the fact and said, your counsel made a difference in our final decision. One voice, one church, one people who say enough is enough of the way we have been doing things. We must set out on a new course. One voice, brethren, raise it. For the glory of God, for your neighbors near and far, good, and for the healing of our world. Amen.
Oh, the Jesus way, is the way of peace. Oh, the Jesus way, is the way of peace.